Well, our next guest is a reporter and a columnist with the National Post, and he is the author of a new book. It's called Don't Be Canada: How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. Tristin Hopper, it's so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
So, I mean, here's the question. Is Canada a great country? Is Canada a broken country? Can one be both at the same time?
What's interesting about this book, so I obviously wrote an entire book about what's wrong with Canada. And the reason I wrote it is because I think Canada is interesting in that there's no reason why we should be failing on all these metrics, why we're one of the worst in terms of medical wait times, why we've done the worst in terms of per capita GDP over the last 10 years as compared to peer countries. I mean, there's any number of ways in which we're not only doing poorly, but we're doing some of the worst of any other countries in the developed world. Now, this is weird because we're still a country on easy mode. I mean, we're still a peaceful country with no hostile neighbors, sitting on a giant pile of resources, and we're able to pick anybody we want from a global pool of people who want to come here to come live here. So there's no inherent structural reason why Canada shouldn't be the world's wealthiest country with the world's greatest healthcare system without any of these problems that we're currently experiencing now.
Yeah.
So they only happen because we decided to do it to ourselves. So, I mean, that's why I'm writing this book, is because I don't think people are aware of the fact that, we're not Poland, we're not Taiwan, we're not these countries that, if you look at problems they have, and Poland has fewer and fewer problems, but they actually have, there's geographic reasons, there's financial, fiscal reasons, there's demographic reasons why nothing works or why there's structural problems. Canada has none of those. So I think people should be much more aware of the fact that we should be doing way better than we are. So yeah, we are a broken country because we could be a great country.
Well, that's the thing. And I mean, people do get their backs up about, the perception maybe that Canada is being attacked, right? And I think if you go point by point through some of these issues that we can get into, you probably find a lot of agreement in the diagnosis. But the idea that, you're I guess, attacking the country somehow, is that
That's
something
right.
you're running
It
into?
actually emerges because, I mean, when I got into this book, I just said, well, there's a number of things I can sort of highlight. And there's 8 chapters. In each one of these chapters, it only got a chapter if it was something that Canada was doing uniquely badly or we were an outlier. So, I mean, there's no chapter about sort of military spending or deficits or whatever, because that's something that you can find similarly bad examples in Europe or the United States or South America or whatever. So it only got a chapter if I could show that, say our assisted suicide system is an outlier. It's worse than any other system like it in the rest of the world. I only put a chapter on gender identity if I could prove that we were more extreme on certain issues of gender identity, even as compared to countries in Europe. So anyway, with all that said, yes, I think. So when I was going into this book, I didn't have a unified thesis as to why all these things happened to Canada seemingly at the same time. And by the end of the book, I got to the idea that I think one of the reasons it did happen to Canada all at the same time is because of this very deep idea of ourselves, that we are a well-managed country, we are low corruption. Canada does not have the problems that happen to other places around the world, and we just didn't have the imagination to see how corruption or bad ideas could take root within our system, which ironically led to a lot of these bad ideas becoming more entrenched than they would have in a normal skeptical country. So I would, to that argument, and I've gotten a lot of that. I mean, every interview I've done for this book, people have said, you shouldn't attack you should write a book about how great Canada is.
Right.
As I'm saying, well, the reason we are getting worse, and we are, there is a marked decline on any number of factors, is because of this idea that, we are Canada, we got the world's greatest healthcare system. And because we just have this blindness towards it, this idea that there are things that do not happen in Canada. As a result of that idea, there are now things that only happen in Canada, bad things.
What I want to touch on, and it's been front and center this week. In fact, you wrote about it for the National Post, the housing issue. Right? I think people understand what's going on with housing. It's something that's very obvious to Canadians, but maybe there's a perception that it's, Canada has Vancouver, Toronto, New York has New York, or the US has New York and San Francisco. There's London, there's Sydney. There's just expensive places. Like, this is a problem elsewhere. But This is something that's in a lot of ways, as you write in the book, uniquely a Canadian problem.
Yes, because it's as I established in sort of the introduction to that chapter. There's no reason why all of these problems. There's no reason why there's no inherent reason why they're happening. This is purely one of policy. Because if you look at, and you'll often see this when foreigners sort of look at their charts of like what's the most unaffordable, and they're like, why is Canada there? Canada, it's got nothing but land, it's got nothing but trees. All of the individual elements that create houses, we have more of them than anywhere else. So it makes the least inherent sense that we have a crisis, and it's just an issue of policy. So it's just thousands upon thousands of decisions that whenever we had a decision that we would make it, and maybe there were some benefits, but it would make it harder to find houses, we always took that decision because we just sort of took it for granted that we didn't have to worry about housing and affordability. This is something that we didn't need to prioritize in terms of policy or whatever. So we just allowed it to become worse and worse and worse and worse until we have the world's worst unaffordability. And again, yeah, that we are an outlier in that. Only Hong Kong, that's changed, but for a period of time, only Hong Kong was more unaffordable. And Hong Kong makes sense. There's not a lot of space. A lot of people want to live there. That you look at Hong Kong, or you look at a Singapore, or you look at New York City, that makes sense why there would be unaffordable real estate. But when you're looking at, say, you can't afford a place to live in Barrie or Brantford, that's a policy issue. We decided to do that to ourselves.
Yeah. There's a broader theme here as we go through these issues, where, as I alluded to earlier, I think Canadians would share a lot of this frustration, or would perceive these to be problems. And yet, in a weird way, we just kind of keep opting for the status quo. Housing is a good example here, where, we've got the former mayor of Vancouver, where, it's kind of ground zero for this problem, who's now in charge of housing
Yes.
in
Yeah.
Canada.
So it is weird. It's this disconnect. I've personally experienced this several times where someone will agree with all of the elements in this book. They'll say, crime's out of control. They'll have very specific problems with the direction Canada is going. And then you ask their electoral choices, and they vote for, incumbent governments that have championed all of these things that they allegedly hate. So as to where that comes from, I think it just comes into, we are an extremely high trust society. And again, more so than any other country in the world. So when the OECD does rankings of public trust, like how much do you trust your institutions? How much do you trust your government? Canada is higher than even like the Scandinavian countries. So it is very much within our national character that we just assume people in charge have our best interests in heart and can be trusted. And we don't even have to pay close attention to them. We can just sort of vote for the same party and assume that everything is going to be well managed. And as a result of that, when things stop being well managed, we don't even sort of seem to have the imagination to imagine that this is a consequence of, how our political sentiments have been in the past.
Yeah.
Go on.
Well, and further to that, I think crime is one of those issues where we sort of have a complacency. We just this notion, or this myth almost, right, that Canada's safe. Canada's a safe country, or we have these perceptions of how things are.
Or you think it's an anomaly, right? So something
or there's a blip here and there.
Yeah, something horrifying will happen, and I often find myself explaining. They'll be like, "Well, there was this this recidivist child molester. He keeps getting out molesting more children, and then he got a token sentence and he's out. Something is wrong. There must be." And I'll say, "No, that is the way it is structured. The system is working exactly as intended for something like that to happen, because that is the routine occurrence." So people think I'm making this up when it comes to issues like criminal justice, when I say, no, if you are a first-degree murderer, so the most serious kind of murder, you're probably getting out of jail in 22 years. They call it a life sentence in the headlines, but that's parole after 25 years. Basically, everybody gets parole, and you're probably going to get early parole, which means you start getting day parole after 22 years. So I would say, most Canadians are just not aware of that. So there's a few issues I highlight in the book that I found issues that the identical version has happened in peer countries like the UK, and issues that have become very controversial in the United Kingdom. For instance, the issue of males going into women's prisons because of gender self-ID. So this is, convicted as a sex offender. You say, "Oh, I'm a woman now." You sign a self-ID form. There's, no surgery, no whatever. And immediately you're qualified to go into a women's prison. That was a huge deal in the UK, indirectly led to the resignation of a Scottish First Minister, Canada has the exact same system, and it is just not an issue here. It wasn't mentioned in elections. It certainly didn't. There were no banner headlines. There were no movements. Major movements to stop it. Nowhere near like the UK. You also see that with the issue of puberty blockers being prescribed to children. The CAS review, also in the UK, all across Europe, within the last couple of years, there's been this recognition that they treated the affirmation process. If a child starts identifying as trans, you start immediately affirming them, get them on puberty blockers. This has been seen as a huge medical scandal in Europe, relatively uncontroversially. Left, right, they're saying we went too far and we got to dial it back. That is just not happening in Canada. And any number of sort of major murder cases, extremely preventable murders, someone who was within the justice system, they were given early release, they were given bail, multiple instances in which they could have been kept in custody and stopped from hurting the public. Any number of these cases, I've seen it in other countries. You'll have legislation named after the victims. This is immediately a top priority, a huge scandal. There are apologies from higher ups. And in Canada, we just allow any number of these to happen without yielding any reform. So we often sneer at the United States for having mass shootings without ever changing their gun laws. But Canada, how many stranger attacks, mass casualty incidents are we prepared to see, committed by people who were on early release, and yet we refuse to change our early release or bail conditions?
Mhm. You did touch on something that is interesting. For as much as people might suggest that it's you attacking the country, there's a subset of issues where it's others who seem to be attacking Canada, and that Canada is not tolerant enough, right? Or Canada has too deeply ingrained racism, so that maybe in some respects, in order to correct that, we've kind of the pendulum has swung too far the other way. And so you highlight some of these issues that you just mentioned. I mean, one that you highlight as well, the Prime Minister talking about an ongoing genocide in Canada,
Mm.
and then just kind of leaving it at that.
Yeah, so that's what I get into in chapter 2. So this is very much the idea of anti-racism, which is different than just sort of racial sensitivity. I mean, and again, I think most Canadians would not be aware that this is the zeitgeist now. So they're thinking, well, this is Canada. We treat people as individuals. The whole goal is not to think about race. If your neighbor moves in, he's got a turban. Ideally, your ideal Canadian does not even notice he has a turban, or that he's a different color, or speaks a different language, or has different ethnic origins. So I think that's how most Canadians still see their ideal vision of the country, and we do it better than almost anywhere else in the world. I would say number one in terms of not having a problem with people of different races or ethnic origins. But what they fail to realize, and I get into detail on this in the chapter, is the American idea of anti-racism, that actually you should hyper focus on issues of racial identity, because any improper outcome, so any sort of unequal outcome, so if you have too many members of a certain race in prison, more members of a certain race in prison than their general share of the population. The doctrine of anti-racism holds that that's because of a racist system. It's not because there are other factors leading to higher rates of Indigenous people being in prison. It's because if you see differential outcomes, that's because the system is racist, and that if your university department has more Asians than their general share of the population, that's because there's something racist in the system, and the only way to fix that is race-focused special treatment for so-called marginalized groups. So this is just completely at odds with the sort of everybody is equal race blindness system that Canada has adopted for the last few decades. And people just don't realize how entrenched that is and how quickly it became entrenched across all our institutions. So you even have reports from the Canadian Armed Forces, from within the federal government, explicitly saying Canada is a racist system and we need to have race-focused job quotas, race-focused government grants, race-specific rules for investment or something. So to the extent that, again, this is an American idea that was embraced almost more wholeheartedly by Canada for the reasons I stated above. We just did not have the skepticism to stop this from becoming the rules. And this is something you don't notice until you're applying for a government job, and there's a checkbox where you have to get into, your particular race, your particular ethnicity, because that particular job is only available for a certain color group.
And what are the consequences of that, though? Are we talking in terms of our social cohesion, or our identity as Canadians? How do you see that impacting in a negative sense?
Well, we've definitely had. It's impossible. So in that anti-racism chapter, I contrast. There was two reports that I contrast. So the first one is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report about Indian residential schools. That is a fantastic report. They, lots of research went into it. It is an excellent work of scholarship, and this was. The idea was we're just going to get into Canada's darkest hour, in which thousands of Indigenous children were explicitly detached from their culture, and the impacts that came from this. We're just going to cover as much of it as we can, document it. Where were the residential schools? Who died? What were the rates of death? How did that compare to the general population? Put it all in one report, make it easy to read so Canadians can just read it and realize this is a part of our history, for better or worse. Contrast that with, right after that, you had the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report. Cost about the same amount of money, same amount of federal resources, and that determined nothing. You read the report, and they do not do any original research. There's no data on who's getting murdered, by whom, under what circumstances, and how to stop it. It's essentially just a bunch of academic gobbledygook about colonial systems and such. It is unreadable. Huge contrast between that and the Truth and Reconciliation report, and that's just a matter of years. So we went from a country that could take a complex issue from our history, address it head on, actually provide nuance on a topic and change the conversation on it, to just complete garbage that didn't fix the problem at all, because the same amount of Indigenous women are still being murdered because we commissioned a multi-million-dollar study which didn't even attempt to fix what it was doing. So when you ask about consequences, yes, there are still high rates of Indigenous women being killed every year, because we can't even hold a government inquiry whose sole goal is to fix that problem, and it just gets sidetracked on sort of some academic issue. Most of the report is about how they can accuse the Canadian government of ongoing genocide, again, rather than actually fix the problem they set out to fix. So yes, this book will get into any number of areas in which we are noticeably declining, but it's just the issue of lost potential, in which we go from a country that is very good at Crown inquiries and addressing these things to completely seized and unable to do anything of substance.
So the takeaways here, Tristan. I mean, the name, the title of the book sort of implies that there maybe other countries should learn a lesson here. But I think, at heart, this is a book for Canadians about where we're
There's
at.
a bunch of stuff
right?
that other countries should be able to read it, because they can not do what we've done.
Mhm.
So there are a great example would be Safer Supply. So if you have an addictions problem in your country, yes, do not follow the Canadian example of just prescribing opioids with very few checks to people and assume that that alone will get them off harder drugs, because as we discovered, and any number of people could have told you before we actually pursued the system, you're just going to have someone who's addicted to fentanyl. If you offer them free hydromorphone, most of the time they're just going to take that free hydromorphone, flip it for money, buy more fentanyl, and then you've got a hydromorphone problem on the black market. So there's any number of these things where we just did something real dumb. It immediately went off the rails. And hopefully, yes, other countries can see that and stop it, because we already proved that it was a dumb idea.
I mean, even the conclusion ends on a bit of a dour note. But I don't know that you're a pessimistic person. I don't know if this is meant
Well, I
to
have
be
to
a
live here,
pessimistic book.
so I have to spend another 50 years in Canada. I would like my ashes to be spread on a certain portion of this country. I would like that portion of the country to not be a charred ruin. So yes, I am invested in the future of Canada, and I would just go back to the fact that it doesn't need to be this way. And it's this weird disconnect for me where this is not a quote unquote conservative book. I live in Victoria, the Lotus Lands,
Right.
most NDP voting city, well, until recently, was the most NDP voting city in Canada. And large portions of my social circle will read this book and say, oh, I agree with everything you write in it. They've all gotten in touch with me. So I don't think this is a political book. I think people agree with the specifics of why these are happening. But there's just that mental barrier of, before we can become what we were, and we were one of the world's most well-managed, safest, least corrupt countries for much of my lifetime. To get back to that, you have to acknowledge when we've taken a dip and to look into why that has happened.
Yeah. Well, the book is out now. It's in high demand. It is called Don't Be Canada: How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once, published by Sutherland House Books, available in all your usual book purchasing outlets.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Amazon, etc.
All right, Tristin Hopper, thank you so much for this. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Breakenridge.